I'm hoping everyone can see that. If not, just please let me know in some way. So what I'm going to talk about today, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about the work I've been doing over the past several years on environmental racism and climate injustices in African Nova Scotian communities. While I was in Nova Scotia, I spent 13 years in Halifax, teaching at Dalhousie University. So I'm pleased to say that on June the 20th, 2024, the Environmental Justice Bill I co-developed with former Liberal MP Lenore Zann received royal assent in the House of Commons 1 week after the passing of the bill at third reading at Senate, becoming the very first environmental justice law or legislation in Canada. And I can't say that I saw that coming when in early 2020, Lenore Zann reached out to me asking me if we should revise or update or strengthen a bill that we developed, an environmental justice private members bill we developed first back in 2015 for Nova Scotia. She wanted to know, should we update that bill and turn it into a federal bill? And I said to her, definitely. When we think about the amount of Indigenous communities across Canada that are near to pipelines, I thought having a bill that focused on all of Canada would be ideal. So the passing of Bill C-226 and it becoming the first environmental justice law in Canada was a culmination of a very long and winding road I had been on since 2012, when I first founded the Environmental Justice Program or organization later called the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, the Enrich Project, which I developed in the spring of 2012 to look at cases of environmental racism initially across Nova Scotia in Indigenous and African Nova Scotian communities. So since 2012, I had developed relationships with communities that had shared their experiences with me about the social, economic, political, and health effects of environmental racism. And these communities include Sabaganagadi First Nation in Nova Scotia, Pictou First Nation in Nova Scotia, the African Nova Scotian community in Lincolnville in Nova Scotia, the African Nova Scotian community in South Shelburne in Nova Scotia. And of course, I heard about Africville and got to know a few former African Nova Scotian, Africville residents, also some of them living in Halifax. I became aware of Grassy Narrows First Nation in doing the work. Grassy Narrows First Nation in Kenora, Ontario. Amjadmong First Nation near Sarnia, Ontario, often referred to as Chemical Valley. More recently came to learn about Wet'suwet'en First Nation in northern BC, and of course the Greater Toronto area. There are specifically racialized immigrant areas in Toronto that are dealing with air pollution and other environmental wastes, such as Scarborough and Etobicoke North. So what is environmental racism? I often have to define environmental racism. Specifically, a long time ago when I first started the project, I used to get a lot of quizzical looks or doubts from people when I mentioned that I was engaged in a project on environmental racism. They had never heard of the term and thought it was a strange term, which it was a strange term. But I felt I needed to, first thing I needed to do was, of course, create awareness, but also to identify a really strong definition of environmental racism. The definition I have on the screen is one that I like because it comes from a community member in the African Nova Scotian community of Lincolnville. And it's so simple, but it's exactly what environmental racism is about. So James Desmond, who you see on the screen, says that environmental racism is the practice, has been locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian, Native and poor white communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism. It's environmental racism to its core, says James. But I also want to give you the more academic definition of environmental racism, which comes from Dr. Robert Bullard, who teaches in Texas, and he's considered to be the father of environmental justice. And he says that environmental racism is about the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous and racialized communities to contamination and pollution from polluting industries and other environmental hazards. So there's the logo for the Enrich project. And as I said, I've been working on issues around climate change and environmental racism for quite a few years. I realized initially how important it was, however, to use an approach to addressing environmental racism, first off, that was community-based, multi-method, collaborative, interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral, and multimedia. And I often say in the beginning, when I started, I didn't know, a lot about environmental racism. I was kind of learning as I went. An environmental activist approached me in 2012 about taking on this project. And when he asked me to do so, I gave him that same quizzical look that other people have given me. I had never heard of the term environmental racism. And once I learned more about it, I realized that, it's ultimately a health project, and I was a health researcher, and that it was an opportunity to work with Indigenous communities, specifically Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia and African Nova Scotian communities, which I had long wanted to work with. But I also realized that I had to do many things in order to get this project off the ground, and that the solution probably to environmental racism is everything, many things at once, not just one activity or one project. So many of the things I did included what you see on the screen. I realized I needed to do a lot of awareness raising, specifically because if people were doubting the project, if people were skeptical about the term, then I needed to raise awareness about environmental racism, but also highlight the kind of systemic underpinnings of environmental racism. Because when you hear the term environmental racism, the first thing you think of is how can the environment be racist? The environment is not a person, it's a thing, right? So I had to kind of explain to people that there are systemic underpinnings to environmental racism, and that ultimately it's a policy issue. It's about policy decisions that place certain industries in certain communities. I also, because I love creativity, I also knew that I wanted to develop multimedia resources. As academics, we know that we have to translate knowledge in different ways because people want knowledge, or they want to learn, they want to be educated in different ways. So over time, I have kind of used everything and everything to kind of translate that knowledge. And that includes mapping, so multimedia resources such as maps using GIS analysis. And that map is on my website. So it's a map of waste sites near to Mi'kmaq communities and African Nova Scotian communities across the province. It also includes co-producing a Netflix documentary with Nova Scotia-born actor Elliot Page, and that Netflix documentary started streaming on March 29th, 2020, and it's based on my very first book on environmental racism called There's Something in the Water. I was really pleased that Elliot asked me to co-produce the film with him and others. And the film got a screening at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 9th, 2019. And of course, I also give interviews for television, radio, podcasts, newspapers, and I use social media as much as I can to share findings from my work. It also, of course, means conducting research. Much of the research is community-based, but the research is typically led by community members. So if I'm working with community members, I provide them with opportunities to lead that research and also share knowledge. As I mentioned earlier, I've also published a book that came out in April 2018, published by Fernwood, a book on my experiences, the challenges I experienced conducting this environmental justice project, and also the kind of celebratory points in conducting this research when things have been really going well and the communities have been heard and the communities have been successful in being heard. I talk about all of that. And then in chapter 5, as a health researcher, for me, the most important chapter was the chapter on health, looking at the health effects of environmental racism. I also am very interested in community capacity building. I don't want to be a researcher who goes into communities and then leaves and never returns. I believe in training and developing capacity. And one way in which I did that was through a nonprofit organization that I co-founded called Rural Water Watch. We got a sense from meeting with community members that they wanted their water tested, but they didn't want the government to do it because they didn't trust the government. So we did water testing in communities, rural Nova Scotian communities at no cost. So that included sort of testing their water in a lab. So one of my colleagues who co-founded Rural Water Watch spent a summer, I believe in 2016, in his lab, just testing the water. It meant that we would provide the results to community members in a report, go back to the community, share the findings with them, educate them on how to keep their water healthy, educate them about the health effects of unclean drinking water, etc. So just building capacity in communities and building knowledge, and also building knowledge among students. So one of the things we did was we included like a master's student in environmental science on our team in order to train that student on how to test water. And I should also mention, we also trained the community members to test their own water, which I think was really a great aspect of the project. And we continue to do that work. I'm no longer in Nova Scotia, but Rural Water Watch continues with the vice president. His name is slipping me right now, but he's a vice president, Fred Bonner. His name is Fred Bonner. He's a geologist, and the work continues. I'm currently holding climate change preparedness workshops in Black communities in the Greater Toronto area and also in Nova Scotia. And I want to focus right now on the climate change preparedness workshops I'm conducting in Nova Scotia that has 2 phases. The first phase began last year with the Sustainable Communities Challenge Fund grant. It began last year in January, and it's called Building Capacity Around Climate Change Preparedness in African Nova Scotian Communities. So last year, around October, I held 12 workshops in African Nova Scotian communities to get a sense of their awareness, the knowledge that they had about climate change. Of course, it was a really great time because of the forest fires and the flooding that has happened in recent times in Nova Scotia and other parts of Canada. So things were really relevant. And I would say that the reason that I started these projects was because I recognized that there was perhaps a lack of engagement in climate change discussions in African Nova Scotian communities. I think it's a two-way issue. I think ENGOs and maybe government need to do a better job of engaging and reaching out to these communities. But I also feel that these communities don't engage because they don't think climate change issues are that relevant to them. And I thought to myself, how do I make this relevant? How do I make it interesting to them? How do I bring in to these discussions their lives, their everyday lives? So this first project, the first phase of it, building capacity, was about that, getting a clear sense of what they knew, discussing issues of evacuation, discussing issues of identity and how those identities shape their experiences with climate change and shape their ability to escape, survive, and address climate change. And I'm talking specifically about issues related to race, culture, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, income, socioeconomic status, and disability, using a climate justice framework, which that typically is what that's about. Climate justice framework understands that different communities are impacted differently and unequally by climate change because of race, because of longstanding structural inequities, because of socioeconomic status. So that was the climate justice framework, was the framework I was using to bring out some of those discussions. And I think it worked really well. At the end of the workshops, everyone said they enjoyed it and they wanted more. Well, I didn't know there was going to be more, but at the end of last year, at the end of 2023, out of the blue, I received an email from Nova Scotia Department of Environment letting me know that they wanted to fund me in the amount of almost $1.8 million. I was in shock, of course. This is the first time I've ever received money without having to apply for it. I think they heard about the first phase and they were quite pleased with what they were hearing, and they wanted to fund me to do a bit of a second phase. I asked them whether or not I can do some more workshops, 13 additional workshops for a total of 25 workshops in African Nova Scotian communities. And they said that that would be fine. So those workshops were completed in August of this year. And the next kind of phase of phase two is what I'm calling the African Nova Scotian Climate Justice Ambassadors Program, which I'm extremely excited about. So now that the workshops are done and all 25 workshops are done, the next phase in early next year is a series of modules. 12 monthly modules that will be instructed by African Nova Scotian popular person called Bradley Day will be instructing the modules. He has his own organization, and he's done a lot of work in community building in African Nova Scotian communities. So these workshops will, as I said, happen once every month for 12 months. And it would include a short presentation, PowerPoint presentation by Bradley Day, 10-minute videos, 30-minute podcast interviews, case studies and role play for small group exercises. Each module will last 20 minutes. Right now, I've hired a filmmaker, Tony Vieira, a York University professor and multimedia artist, who is filming a 1-hour documentary in Nova Scotia on climate change in African Nova Scotian communities, where we are getting diverse voices from across Nova Scotia. That includes artists like spoken word artists and musicians and singers and organizational heads and climate experts, etc., to talk about experiences with climate change, and historians, I should also mention. And that's going to be for the 1-hour documentary film, the signature film for this ambassadors project. And then he will also be filming or taking from that documentary 12 10-minute videos that will be for the module specifically, and then recording 12 podcasts, one for each of the 12 modules over the year. So this is going to be a very multimedia, very interactive module. And the participants, the people who participated in the workshops last year and this year, will be the participants for these modules and will receive an honorarium for participating, right? Who gets that? Like, I have students, I teach at McMaster, and we don't pay our students to attend my course, right? But we are going to provide them with an honorarium for participating. During the course of these modules, they're going to learn how to do a climate resilience community plan for each of the 25 communities, not a general African Nova Scotian climate plan, but one for each of the 25 communities, looking at the very specific historical, geographic, political, and social profile of each of the 25 African Nova Scotian communities. And they're also going to do demonstration projects where they go into their own community and provide knowledge to other community members who are not part of my project. And I think that is the goal of my project, is that I hope there will be a kind of intergenerational handing down of information about climate change to people who might think they're not interested, to people who might think it's not relevant, but having people share that knowledge with them. So that's the work that we're doing currently. I just wanted to
Ingrid?
end. Yes? Am I
Sorry,
done?
we're running out of time. If you could just do a quick 10-second summary, and we'll move on to the panel.
Okay, so I'll just say that, as I mentioned earlier, all the work for those modules are being done currently. And after the modules are done, we were thinking about what to do with the modules themselves. And we want this to keep going. So it might be that we donate the modules to African Nova Scotian Services Division, the Education Department, or the Buddy Day Learning Institute. We are looking for an African Nova Scotian educational organization that we can donate the module to, so the learning can continue after the project is completed in early 2027. Thank you very much
Great.
for listening.
Thank you so much.